Hello everyone, I'm Janine Herzig, AusIMM Director, Immediate Past President and Chair of AusIMM's International Advisory Forum. It's my great pleasure to be hosting this international webinar. This is the final in our three-part series, and a big thank you to everyone joining us online, including a special welcome to our AusIMM members and fellows. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and First Nations people of the many lands on which we meet today. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay respect to their elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge my fellow presenter and chair of the JORC committee, Steve Hunt, as well as our AusIMM international reps who are joining us online today. And they include Mike Jones for Indonesia, Adrian Penny from Singapore, Johnson Koh from Singapore, and Yuan Gao from Beijing. So welcome to all, and we're looking forward to having an increase in the number of our international reps in our global community in the very near future. And we really look forward to this increased engagement, which is so important during these times. So just a few housekeeping items. Everybody's on mute today to avoid presenter distraction and noise feedback. We encourage you to ask questions. We've had some great questions in our previous two webinars, so please type those into the question box available on your side panel. Those questions can either be for myself or Steve, or they can be comments, and we welcome all of those. And a copy of the webinar will be sent via email to everyone who has registered in the next few weeks. We also have a very quick survey when you leave the webinar, and we encourage you to complete that survey. We've had some really good feedback on the first two webinars, and one of those items of feedback has actually been to have more of these webinars. So we certainly take that comment on board. And just while we were preparing for today's webinar, we actually said that we'll most likely hold a fourth one now for the Australasian audience as well. So we're really pleased with the uptake that we've had and the amount of interest. So before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of everyone at AusIMM that we were in very difficult circumstances, and these circumstances are not improving on many fronts. So I do hope that you, your family, your loved ones and your peers are keeping safe and well. We've all been impacted by this ever-changing pandemic and the flow-on effects of lockdowns and restricted travel. Some of you will be enjoying additional freedoms as your jurisdictions reach higher levels of vaccination. Others will be experiencing a very different reality. And just in the last 24 hours, of course, we've had New Zealand go into lockdown in addition to pretty much the entire population of Australia now. So we recognise that everybody is doing it tough. We're fortunate in Australasia that we haven't had the sort of fatality rates that other countries have seen, and we certainly recognise the situation in some other jurisdictions, including Indonesia and India in particular, there are many people from those jurisdictions here with us today. So we have over 160 registrations for today's webinar, which is the winner out of the three, so you'll be pleased to know, but we have had over 100 for each of the three webinars. Today we have 28 countries represented, and as I mentioned, the three highest representations outside Australia are Indonesia, China and India. So welcome very much to everybody who's joining us today. So AusIMM shapes careers, showcases leadership and creates communities and upholds professional standards. And a critical part of our role is to bring our global communities together through initiatives like this one. And it's very important when many of us are not able to connect with each other in the face-to-face settings. So we're delighted to be able to bring you together to share knowledge, which is what is at the heart of what we do at AusIMM. So I'll hand over shortly to Steve to provide an update on the progress of the JORC code review. As a metallurgical engineer myself, My significant interactions with the code came later on in my career when a client requested sign-off on the metallurgy as it was project critical. This was a graphite project, and that was around 2011. It wasn't until about 2018 when the first metallurgist was actually officially appointed to the JORC committee. Now, of course, it's quite commonplace to have many other disciplines, in addition to geos, mining engineers and METs, involved in various elements of the reporting process. And this is a very good thing. People working in resources are aware of the heightened focus on social responsibility and performance. And this was highlighted in the survey feedback that Steve will run through shortly. Without broad public trust and acceptance, it is becoming increasingly common for financiers and shareholders to be tentative about backing resources projects that lack public trust and regulatory certainty. AusIMM members must be aware of ESG factors in their professional work and apply them where necessary. AusIMM's social responsibility framework highlights 3 levels of ESG due diligence. These are firstly, awareness, secondly, understanding by those in leadership roles, and thirdly, competence by those who have accountability in environmental and social performance areas of practice, demonstrated through their professional qualifications and experience. And this last point, competence, goes to the heart of the JORC code and this review. How we define a competent person and how to best demonstrate this in a reasonable and consistent way. ESG matters are a very important consideration when determining modifying factors for JORC compliant reporting of reserves and resources. And we've only just today finished Module 3 of AusIMM's Professional Certificate in Social Performance and ESG, which I am actually attending that course, so it's very pertinent. And I would also like to just give a shout out to AusIMM Director Mark Noppy and also branch member from New Zealand, Paul Weber, who are part of our ESG Social Responsibility Committee for the AusIMM, and thank them for joining us today. So without further ado, Steve, I'll hand over to you. Just a reminder, get those questions in. We look forward to taking those at the end of Steve's presentation. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Janine. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the time zones. The main point of today is to give everyone an update of where our JORC code review is travelling at the moment, and to really map out the process going forward. We're quite early in a significant update of the code. We're not as far advanced as we had planned to be by this stage. The whole COVID implications for us has actually created quite a few issues, and we've had to take some different approaches to get this far. So what I'm going to provide you with is a summary of the survey feedback that we've pulled together, and also really the roadmap of the next stages and the next steps. A bit back to basics. The JORC committee's got a lot of stakeholder groups. Yeah, we've been in continuous existence since 1970s. And the primary parent bodies being the Minerals Council, the AusIMM, and the Australian Institutes of Geoscientists, the AIG. But we have a lot of other stakeholders involved in this. Using JORC, if you're an Australian listed company, is mandatory to report under the ASX and the ASIC, which is the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, the actual controllers of that environment. We also have use of JORC reports in a lot of government and quasi-government areas to support mineral tenements, to government agencies. We've got our peer international societies linked up through the CRISCO network and the like, as well. Who are the users? Well, we've got a whole bunch of users. Yourselves are likely to be amongst them: technical people, consultants, investors, companies, company directors, and the like. So JORC's got a very, very wide user base. People come into using JORC or being familiar with JORC through many different doors. One of the things that we were keen to do when we set about the regular code update is to make sure we engage with the broader stakeholder groups. We had a pretty difficult year last year. Lots of people had a pretty difficult year last year. We were actually in March last year sitting down with the committee planning our public engagement process in March 2020. Within a couple of weeks, all the lockdowns around the world started happening, and our plan to actually do town hall meetings with our stakeholders across our region really fell over, and we had to do something quite different. This really required us to have a good think about things. We decided that what we would do, in the absence of being able to meet up with people in smaller groups, is to set up an online survey process, and then to also start engaging through things like Zoom meetings with various stakeholder groups. This is obviously harder work than when you can sit down with people, but it was really the only way we could get started. And so in 2020, we went through a process of engaging an industrial strength surveying tool, developing a set of questions around the code and areas of the code that were viewed as being either working well or not working as well. And the other important thing we needed to do was to understand the background of the people that were putting their submissions in. So we asked questions about their engagement with the code, how long they'd been in the industry, what sector of the industry they were from, etc. The primary piece of information feedback for us then has been the survey, which we stood up in the back part of last year and ran through till the end of the first quarter this year. So the blue arrows there is pretty much what's happened up to this point in time, and I'll give you some feedback on what we've learnt out of that. We're in the process now about looking at some of the higher rated areas of concern and setting up working groups with professional bodies and individuals to help us understand and peel apart some of the information in the survey a bit better. Effectively, the broad process will be that we'll take all of that feedback from the working groups back into a circulation draft, which we hope to put out early next year. And then we have a formal process that sits behind that, because the JORC code actually has to go through government approval and sign off by the minister. And so even when we think we've got all of the elements complete, we have to go through the formal ministerial sign off. This is really a map about the process and the steps so far. We had a series of general engagement meetings with a number of stakeholder groups, including the parent bodies, ASIC, who are the market oversight in our part of the world, companies oversight. We've had 3 direct meetings with ASIC, and we had the survey, which I'll talk about in a while. Each of those has given us a very clear view of where the key issues are and really the ranking of the stress points around the code. Within that code review area, we're still doing direct consultation with various stakeholder groups. An example would be the West Australian Mines Department, or the equivalent in different states and territories of Australia. We're also doing direct consultation with groups like our peer codes around Crisco. The working groups I've talked about, and I'll move forward onto what are the areas of focus there. And there are some parts of the review we can execute within the committee ourselves, which is really the third box. There's a significant piece of work that really belongs as much with the parent bodies, and particularly the membership parent bodies of AusIMM and AIG, really around the role and the processes to manage the nomination of competent persons. There is some stress in the room on a number of flanks, the breadth of declarations, the much larger group of modifying factors people are signing off on, and the sense of it's not always clear how people are nominated or they're within their self-nomination processes where their expertise actually lies. So we'll talk about that separately. But effectively, we are looking at standing up a joint task force with the parent bodies to solely focus on the competent persons issues, while a whole lot of the other more mechanical issues in the code are being dealt with down that separate pathway. We do have to tie it back to the international codes. We do have to go through a formal ASIC review at the end. And if we can't do those things, we really can't progress. So we have to actually take all these ideas and what about this and what about that, and at some point get them back into drafting. We do then have to get that drafting back out to the stakeholders. So that feedback loop, which will happen in the first half of next year, is very important, and that'll come through and be then put up for approval. If I jump across to the survey, we opened up the survey in December 2020 and it ran through till April. We extended the opening period for a little while at the end there. We got over 500 survey submissions. They were from individuals, they were from industry bodies, they were from consulting groups, other organisations, and we actually collected a lot of information around who was filling in the survey. And so by technical background, this is the split. So about half of the people that submitted in the survey were geoscientists, mining engineers, then company executives and directors, some processing people, and a bunch of others, which included legal people and the like, company secretaries. You might say geology, that's a lot of geologists. Just remember that the JORC code is in place for people that are even just reporting exploration results. So there's a lot of people that use the JORC code very much for the front end, and they actually don't use it in the resource or reserve stages later through the code. And so that piece of the code, you know, that balance probably makes reasonable sense. The other element that we covered in the survey was, that's great, so we understand your technical background. Now, tell us how long you've been working with the code, or perhaps how long you've been in the industry. The vast majority of the respondents had more than 20 years experience in the industry, so significant sort of understanding of how the industry works to perhaps match up with how to try and apply the JORC code in their business. We also then found a similar distribution of a lot of people, at least in the north of 15 years, 15 to plus 20 years experience, with a lot of exposure to the code. So effectively, we were getting feedback from groups that had a lot of JORC code experience. That's useful for us to understand that when, you know, people with that sort of experience level say that they think there's an issue, that's good indication to us, is that they've seen that issue over a significant period of time, and they're, you know, raising it for those reasons. There's a lot of talk, we talk about the key principles of the code: transparency, materiality, and competence. We asked the questions in a number of different ways. We asked whether people felt overall the key principles, the three key principles, were easy to understand. Most people said yes. You know, 70% came back. Only 3% said the overall understanding of the code was an issue. But then we came back and we broke it down a little bit and said, look, now let's just talk about how well you understand, or where you think the the concerns might be around transparency. I think transparency came out of it as being understood better. People at times struggled with materiality, but there was a bigger issue flagging out when we went in and looked at competence. And so, you know, the ability for other parties to assess competence in JORC reporting, you know, had a less comfortable position than the transparency elements. One of the other areas in the survey, we said, look, how do you use the code? It's good that you understand it and whatever, but where is your primary use? You can see very heavily weighted towards preparing competent persons reports, mineral resources and ore reserves reports, expert reports, fairly high amount of use of understanding other people's releases, preparing your own releases, analysing what's in the marketplace, making company recommendations, and that's like as annual disclosure, continuous disclosure. You can see all the triggers there. Still very, very heavily weighted to people using the code for preparing technical disclosures. It's good on the international call to talk about this because there's a misunderstanding at times, you know, within you know, the Australian market, where the expectation is that people are only using JORC for reporting on the ASX, and they don't actually use other markets. That's not true. There are a lot of people who are out there as competent persons or as qualified persons in Canada who are multiple code users. So there's a pretty strong understanding of the crossover issues between the primarily ASX code users and people who are using TSX, LSE, JSE, and you can see for those on the call, the HKEX, SGX, ISX, NZX. Okay, so people who might even be on the call today probably put their information in the survey, which is good. So we did get a broad base of commentary from people who are outside the Australian only usage. We also asked, what experience have you got applying different codes? And you know, 30% plus of the respondents had some experience with the CIM 43101 sets of rules in Canada. A fair amount of crossover then with Valmin, SAMREC, the SEC, various other Crisco codes as a bundle, and then also then broken down by the individual codes. And again, for the people on the call, you can see the Indonesian code there, and you can also see reference to Mongolia and India. So there are, you know, I think the idea that we are all part of an international community here, and it's important for us to understand too, is that the relationship between the JORC code, once we finalise our reviews, and the various other Crisco codes is very important that we manage going forward. So, what came out of the survey? So, next couple of slides, I'll talk to those. There were probably 3 big issues and a bunch of crossover issues. The 3 biggest issues, as Janine talked about at the top of the call, the rising prominence of what we call ESG issues, environmental, social, governance issues. And that's slightly different depending on your operating environment. It can be more about how difficult it is to get development permitting from a government perspective. It can be more about social engagement from a social perspective, or it can be in some areas much more tilted towards environmental. And if you've got a really stressed project, each of them can be equally as difficult for you to progress through. The current version of the JORC code has got its roots in 10, 20 years ago, and those issues are not well covered in the disclosure guidance within the code. and that was flushed out during the survey. As flagged earlier, the competent person, the range of competence issues, there's definite pressure on acceptance of just self-nomination without verification for competent persons. We've had direct feedback from the regulators in ASIC that they're not very comfortable with that. And there's also a need to look at how competence can be spread through areas like ESG. So if you've just got a mining engineering background, and one of the major technical risks in developing your project is environmental sign-off, how do you get that sign-off? And so that question is absolutely there. Reasonable prospects is always high on our list. Reasonable prospects is, again, in the opinion of the competent person, but quite often the actual underlying assumptions aren't very well disclosed, and that's an area that drew a lot of comment in the survey. There are other issues there. If I go onto the columns on the right-hand side, relationships, cross relationships with the ASX listing rules, scoping studies, better ways to lay out and improve some of the prompts in Table 1. Competent persons I've already mentioned, ESG I've already mentioned, mechanisms in the market to re-report prior work, which is more a crossover issue with the ASX listing rules and with ASIC. Guidance, better ways to host guidance on the internet, searchable guidance, where are the good worked examples of how I could apply this? And so there's a working group we're looking at in there. And the cross relationships, as I've talked about, with the other Crisco codes. So they were really the broader hotspots that came out. So what are we doing about it? Well, over the last week or so, and we're just in stand-up mode, each of those topic areas on the right-hand side, we're setting up working groups. The working groups will take all the detailed output of the survey in that sector and put that on the table. We're bringing in people from the professional bodies. We're bringing in people from various parts of industry in a targeted way around each of those areas. And the working groups will pick apart the issues in there and look to, is there a substantive issue in the code as it's currently structured? What could be done? What are the possible approaches? And then there'll be some recommendations come out of each of the working groups to go into the redrafting process. Not all of these things will be revolutionary. Some of them, they can be anything from fixing a few words in the code to make it clearer, but some of them might be quite structural about how are we going to park searchable guidance, for instance, on websites and the like. The big ones, the big elephants in the room are probably those top 3 or 4 there, the competent persons with the parent bodies, the reasonable prospects, ESG. ASIC is very focused on the under-reporting of key risks and is looking for ways to get greater clarity for both big and small investors around critical risks. They don't like the idea that we, as technical people, might put it all in the gobbledygook of Table 1 and not make it clear if it's a project threatening risk. And so we have to have a look at those and some of the others there. So those working groups are really in stand-up mode now, and we will be progressing that work in parallel across all those working groups between now and the end of the year. A bit more about the working group structures. There'll be 2 of the JORC committee on every single one of those working groups, and they'll be there to cross-link, and then obviously we'll be then trying to bring all that back into the code. We've got to do a lot of work to make sure that we don't trip over our own feet between the working groups and manage the scope, so we're covering all the issues, and we're doing it in a as good a pathway as we can. Bit of a refresh where we're heading. So we're in this July to December period. We're standing up the working groups. There'll be structured meetings throughout each of those and they'll run till the end of the year. At the end of the year, we have to go back into drafting mode to take all of those inputs, and that'll take us a couple of months over the end of year period. And in Q1, there'll be a draft go back for public engagement, as we've talked about earlier. And then once we receive feedback, we'll have another crack at it. The unknown part is the approval process. That's at ministerial approval. Somewhere around the first half of next year, there'll be an election in Australia, and that could slow things down too until whatever new government is in place and ministers are appointed, and this gets in their calendar. So we could have a situation where we're ready, but it takes a number of months before it progresses through that process, which we don't control. So I'm going to stop there, and there's a couple of things on that slide that are important there. Any concerns or anything you would like to write a submission around with the JORC code update at jorc.org, the first email address, our website, and we've also set up a LinkedIn page where we're also posting any items on the way through. So, questions?
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Steve. They appear to be a bit of a shy bunch today, but I'm sure they will start to come through. But we did get a couple of questions ahead of the webinar as well. So just before I move to that, I did want to just give a shout out to Benny Cha, who joined us a little bit late, and Benny's our long-standing chair of the Hong Kong branch, which was actually the first branch to come into AusIMM before outside of the Australasian region about 7 or 8 years ago. So welcome to Benny. Now, a couple of questions that came through earlier. First one, Steve, do ethical standards associated with transparency, materiality and competent persons only apply to Australasian, or do they apply globally?
They absolutely apply anytime anyone as a competent person is saying that this piece of work is reported under the JORC code. So the key principles of the code up there in those clauses 4, 5 and 6 right up the front of the code actually cover the entire code. So what you can't do is say, I'm just reporting on the back of the code and I'm not applying those key principles throughout everything I do. It's one of the more difficult areas for a competent person to talk and to get the balanced presentation of the information. The transparency piece, the best test for transparency is if I don't say something that is critical to this project, I am actually misinforming the potential investors. Materiality, as I've said, is a hard one for people to understand. What appears to be material to one person might not be to another. Likewise, you know, the obvious test is if it was found out that this item was not appropriately reported and disclosed, how would that go down with the administrators or market regulators or whatever? And competence, as we've talked about, you know, do you have the experience and capability to sign off on this piece of work? Having said that, in the international environment, we have some issues. One of the issues for us is that when you report under the JORC code in Australia, you are not only bound by what the code says, you're also bound by additional disclosure requirements in the ASX listing rules. And if it is in a report is found deficient because of the way it's presented, and particularly if the way the company is presenting it, then there is an ability for ASIC as the regulator to take the company to task. There's also the ability of the ASX to issue a notice to the company and ask for a clarification or a republication of the supporting information. And so in an international environment, at times, a piece of work can be done under following a JORC code process, but then if the disclosure never gets out into a market or a visible environment, it doesn't have the same peer review elements as it would have in a market reporting environment. So it's not as much about the international, but it's about do some, and I don't think I'm being unfair, allegedly JORC reports never see the light of day. If they never see the light of day, it's very, very hard for them to be part of the same sort of review process that would happen if that same reporting was done to a marketplace. So that's an area that we are looking at. It's an area of concern at times, and particularly for things like off-market capital raisings and the like. You know, we will have to have a look at what else we could say that says if you're going to do a JORC report, it should be a full JORC report and not discounted in any way in terms of its integrity or its transparency.
Thanks, Steve. Some really important points there. Another question submitted ahead of time was asking whether the JORC code minimum reporting standards only apply for public or to all forms of exploration results, which is kind of tied into the previous question.
Yeah, there's and we've got some interesting crossover issues. So one that I've shared on other discussions is, for instance, private prospecting groups in, for instance, West Australia within the Australian environment must lodge a JORC report to the department to convert a mining lease. So even if it's a very small mining lease, if it's not a public company, it's not even on the ASX or anything similar, they're being asked by a government to provide a JORC report, but they don't have a reporting vehicle for the JORC report like a company would. And so there are these issues around generation of technical reports for state governments, for mining departments, generation of information that goes to a different customer that weren't the original intention of setting up the JORC code, but there are issues that we have to have a look at and see if there's a better way to improve that. And obviously, if it's for private purposes, completely off market, then that's an environment where there's no reach by the regulators or really by JORC itself.
Exactly. Thanks. Now, Steve, Tao was asking whether it's still possible to join a working group. Is that still possible?
We're fairly heavily oversubscribed. We did park it up on the JORC website a couple of weeks ago. Look, if you're keen and if one of those areas looks like something that you feel you've got some knowledge and experience of, please send an email through to update@jorc.org, that top email address, and Jamie, who's our project manager, will pick it up. So we haven't quite settled all the groups yet, but we're working through that in the next couple of weeks. The other thing we'll be doing with the people that, because we can't manage a working group with 20 people on it, we're trying to get a group of about 8 in each of them, but we'll be asking the people who volunteered, if they don't make it onto the group, to present a paper or any submissions that they want in the area. So we're not saying we don't want to hear from you, but we're saying one of the issues we'll have with the working groups is, can you pretty much turn up for a meeting every 10 days or so between now and the end of the year? And that can be very tough for people who've got a lot of interest but don't necessarily have the time in their lives. So we are asking people who've volunteered on ESG, for instance, if they don't make the group, please write us, even in dot form, your main concerns and your recommendations, and we can take that in and look at it, which is the main thing.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. I mean, it's great that we have so much interest out there, but you're right, you need a practical number of people in these groups. but of course not to say that anyone will be excluded from the process. And really that ties in well to two questions that are on a similar matter. So we have Keith and Ian who are asking about the transparency of constituting the working groups, and also whether each group will have an international AusIMM member. So I think the answer is probably define transparent. I think we've consulted far and wide, but I'll let you take that question on, Steve, and also the international question.
Look, there's an important point here. Not everyone who has put their submission into the survey is keen that that information can be spread. So no one will join a working group who doesn't sign up to a confidentiality agreement not to share that detailed information. It is not public information because the permission hasn't been granted by the people that have submitted it. It's actually against the law for us to share that raw information in many parts of the world. Okay, so we want to, the process we're going through is to try and de-identify the information and the responses from the individuals, but there's still a risk that by what they've said, and if in the long form comments, that they could be identified. So the first thing is we'll have to sign up everyone on a working group to a confidentiality agreement. The working groups will then get the detailed responses of all the areas in that working group scope to use as an information pack to work through. In terms of the international community, yeah, we're expecting that more often than not, there'll be someone on each working group who is not necessarily in the Australian region. So we'll try and balance it out as best we can. I think the other area there is we will be inviting some people onto the working groups who work in that particular area. So we'll be crossing over into in the ESG area as an example of getting a couple of the ESG experts, I suppose, in the field that work in solution seeking with mining companies about how to engage and how to make projects successful in that space, and to understand those elements too. So it's tricky. I can guarantee there's no version of where we end up that would make everyone happy, but we're going to do our best to make it as good as we can.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Ciceron is asking about a transition period similar to what we did in the last review, and I would assume the answer is yes, we will have a transition period.
Yes, so typically it's between 6 and 12 months. I would think that it's unlikely that the code would be up and fully signed off before the later part of next year. And so I expect the earliest possible requirement would be perhaps end of financial year, 12 months from now. And if not, then it would be the end of the calendar year. No point really coming out, depending on how companies report. You know, you've got to pretty much meet one of those dates. So the earliest possible would really be June 30, 2022, and that would assume that, June 30, 2023, and that would assume that we had largely got the circulation drafts out by the middle of next year. So yeah, 12 months sort of target, but really depending on when the sign-off comes from the minister. So the closer we are to Christmas next year, the closer it could be till the end of the year, and plus 12. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about being sensible, isn't it? You know, we want to give people every chance to be able to conform to whatever changes are in the new code.
Yeah, so what we
So
did last time, it's worth flagging to the group, is that we allowed people to report under the newer version of the code from the time it was ratified, but then we set a closure date that you could not continue to report on the previous code after the closure date. So that would likely to be the same outcome. The regulators were fairly happy with that. So that basically would be that transition period becomes the sunset clause on reporting under JORC 2012.
excellent. Which leads nicely into a question from Mark, who's asking about foreign regulators and whether they formally accept JORC reporting.
It's a little bit different depending where you are. There are cross-reporting rules in different places. It's messy. For instance, the recent update of the US SEC rules to the SK 1300 rules was meant to give us a Crisco-based reporting approach in the US, but there are some differences there, and even the most closely aligned, which is the Canadian regs, there are some slight differences in the way things can be signed off, and some of the additional information. It's important to us not to create a wide gap between all of the Crisco codes. That just leads to fragmentation, and that either leads people to seek what they perceive to be the easiest market, or perhaps companies that are listed in more than one location having to write unique and different reports in each location, which is counterproductive to both their investors, and obviously it's an additional burden for the companies. There's a lot of interest. About 10 days ago, with other members of the JORC committee, we actually had a Zoom call with members of the Canadian regulators from BC and the TSX, and talked about our update process. And so, they're keen to make sure that they understand where we're heading as well. And so we'll be doing those sorts of conversations with people in other regions as well.
Great. Our Beijing rep, Ewan, is asking whether the JORC code will include implications about mitigation of the climate crisis, especially in the post-pandemic era.
Great question. I think it'll fall under the ESG discussions. One of the things that's becoming clearer in some parts of the world, and if you don't need a very good prediction crystal ball to get to the point where, if you can't in your technical studies provide a view on the carbon footprint or energy intensity of your new mining project, you might find it hard to raise investment capital. And so it is something, a declarations and inclusion of some commentary in the code around what are viewed to be broader ESG issues is, I expect, an outcome that we'll have. We will not be writing the international standards of what has to be declared, but we have to, under the key principles, make sure that the risks in those areas are visible to users of the code and investors. And so examples would be, the one I've used fairly frequently is after the South American tailings dam collapses in Brazil, the ICCM, International Council Mining Metallurgy, set up a working group to develop really a technical standard for building and management of tailings dams. And so there is now an international guideline that exists. One of the things in a JORC report you could be doing is saying we've done all of our tailings dam investigations, following the international tailings standard. And that's an example of how, as better guidance around what investors want to see is available, that can be included in the JORC reporting. One of the broader issues around climate change, climate intensity, or climate impact intensity, or those sorts of things, is that there aren't any clear guidelines that are multi-jurisdictional and are accepted as a standard type approach. But I'd be surprised, before too long, and I'd be surprised even today, is if you could look at a major mining investment and be silent around climate impact as much as social impact. It's not 1970 anymore. We have to move with the reality of the times, and if you can't make a good case for these things, then investors probably won't give you their money to develop that mining project.
No, absolutely, and it's one thing to have ICMM with their standards, but of course it also comes back to the auditing of those for compliance and so on, which is very important as well. We could do a whole webinar on tailings very easily, and in fact we have done. But Benny from Hong Kong is saying, misconception that JORC is a set of rules rather than guidelines. However, in some jurisdictions, more stringent rules are needed rather than based on a code of ethics that might be applicable in other regions. So how can the JORC committee tackle this aspect of defining a competent person, using a sort of a code of ethics as the basis of that?
I think part of it is getting the additional guidance around how to apply the code well improved. And so the idea that the definitions of the code are obviously very, very high level, and they're very common right across the Crisco environment. The next piece is that the guidance in the code can be clearer in many cases than it is. The third level of information is how to apply the code well, which would sit outside of the code as something we need to improve. I think case studies, worked examples, we used to put those things in monographs in the AusIMM. We could do that again, but some of that actually needs to be searchable and on the web, so you can, how do I do this sort of information. I think that helps people not to interpret down the wrong pathway. But the other piece of that is we are looking at whether the basic 5 years appropriate experience and self-nomination as a competent person is enough for the modern world. And we'll be sitting there with the parent bodies and having those tough discussions around whether, for instance, verification of the supporting resume, confident CV of that person to support their competence in an area might be a public document, for instance. That's a fair change, and that's got to be a proper discussion and work through. So a combination of these things coming together can improve. But is there a single element? No.
No, look, and we're getting a lot of questions coming through on this topic, Steve, which is probably not surprising. So we've had a couple come through. Adrian Penny's asking about assessing competent persons. Tao has raised the matter of distinguishing between RPOs and competent persons, which is, of course, causing some confusion in many countries where, people, and even, goes to something we discuss a lot, which is the abbreviation to CP, which, of course, we do not allow for a competent person. So we must be very clear about what is a chartered professional, what is a competent person or a qualified person if you're talking Canada. So I guess you've touched on some of the ways we might do that, but perhaps one starting point in the declaration of being a competent person is that you have to be chartered or accredited. You have to actually prove that you're qualified, that you're current, and that you've been audited and so on. So is that kind of a natural perhaps first step? I know it's not simple, but
somewhere between where we are, which is if you're a member and you've got a professional background in an area and perhaps you understand that style of mineralisation or mining, you can declare that you're a competent person for that commodity style if you've got 5 years experience in it. That's all about you being clear and fully transparent about your competence and your background. The other end of that spectrum could be a full member grade registration approach with verification of qualifications and the like. Somewhere between those, I think we'll have to move. No one's made that decision yet. That working group has to come through. And of course, what it has to do is provide a mechanism that works equally as well for the AIG geoscientist members as it does for any AusIMM members. But the idea is that if you say, look, I'm a competent person in gold mining, then your supporting resume that says I've worked here and I've worked there and I've got this experience over this amount of time should be available to be found. At the moment, it's actually not. So I can claim to be a competent person in an area. And if someone's worried about that, they can't necessarily find my CV that supports my claim of competence in that area. And that's a problem, and certainly a problem when there are complaints or ethical issues to follow. You don't accidentally become a competent person, and so what's a better process to manage that? And there's a lot of concern coming back from the regulators around even experienced engineers then signing off on projects that have a lot of environmental or social issues, and the inability perhaps under our current mechanism to bring in subsidiary sign-offs. So subsidiary sign-offs, as done in some other areas, that might be a mechanism that helps us spread the technical expertise appropriately without it being one person standing up for all elements. Doesn't let the primary competent person withdraw from the discussion, but it is another way to look at how we can manage the complexities we have.
Yeah, look, absolutely. It's also, what we've noticed coming through a lot too is if you have to scramble to find 5 years experience in a style of mineralisation, then you're probably not a competent person. It really should be a case of very, very clear cut. And if you're having to think about that, then you're probably not. And,
timing and commercial pressure, if you're really only 4.5 years,
yep,
you shouldn't be agreeing to doing that sign off, for a company because the MD of the company wants it by Friday. That's difficult. If there was a formal process that said, actually, I can't add a new competency to my area of expertise because I've actually got to run it past, an AusIMM process, it would at least help, people under duress stretching where they shouldn't. It doesn't have to be bad intent. It can be a lot of duress. And so
absolutely.
We do need to look at the entire strength there. Just remember, if you want to operate as a qualified person in Canada, you must be an RPGO, fully signed off. So difficult, but it's an area we have to look at. And of course, this is a once in a JORC generation chance to have a look at our calibrating our process and controls.
Absolutely, and I think the point you raised about there being more than one custodian as well as an important one, that it's not just AusIMM who needs to make these decisions. We do need to take into account our other stakeholders, and it's one thing to say RPGO, okay, you can now become a qualified person in Canada, but we're dealing with so many other disciplines now, and it's really important to incorporate all of those into whatever framework we settle on. So we are out of time, and I know you've got a hard stop, Steve. So any more questions, please send those through to the website, the address that Steve's got on the slide there. Yep. But thank you very much. It's been a fantastic engagement we've had again today. Clearly, we need to hold more of these. I think we will certainly continue to keep everybody informed as we move through this process. So any closing words, Steve, before we sign off?
No, look, thanks everyone. We're still quite early in the update process. As I said, we've got to get another draft, and look, there's probably an opportunity early next year when we've got a circulation draft of some potential solutions to rerun a process like this and come back to everyone. So that's a promise, but we've got to get our work done between now and then.
Exactly. Yes, plenty on the plate, that's for sure. So with that, we will sign off. Thanks all again for coming, and stay safe.